was 10 years old when my parents moved us deep into the northern woods of Maine, not far from the Canadian border. They called it a fresh start, more space, less noise, cleaner air. To me, it just meant isolation. Our new home was surrounded by nothing but towering pine trees, long stretches of gravel road, and a silence that felt too thick for comfort. We had no close neighbors. The closest house, from what I was told, sat a half-mile to the east, through a stretch of woods that even our dog refused to enter. I never met whoever lived there. My parents said it was just an old man who kept to himself. That was all. "Don't worry about him," my dad said once when I asked. "He's harmless." But I never asked because I was curious. I asked because I had seen him. The first time was barely a week after we moved in. I was in my room on the second floor, staring out the window late one evening. The sun had gone down, and that dim gray-blue twilight hung in the air. That's when I saw him standing just at the edge of the tree line, too far to make out any details. Just a tall, still figure in a long coat. At first I thought it was a tree, but then he moved. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just ducked under my blanket and told myself it was a shadow, just a trick of the fading light. But the next night he was there again, and this time he had a flashlight. It flicked on suddenly, the beam slicing through the dark and sweeping slowly across our yard, back and forth, until it landed directly on my bedroom window. The light held there for just a second, then clicked off. I remember holding my breath so hard my chest hurt. I told my mom the next morning. She smiled like I was telling her a spooky campfire story and brushed my hair back. "It's probably just your imagination," she said, but I knew what I saw. And I knew the light had landed right on me. For a while, nothing happened. A week went by, then another. I started to believe my mom was right. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the woods and the dark and the newness of it all were just playing tricks on me. I even slept with the window open one night, just to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. But then on a Thursday night in early July, I woke up to something different. It wasn't the flashlight this time. It was a sound, a soft tapping. Not on the glass, but on the wall beside my bed. Rhythmic, deliberate, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was a branch. Maybe the wind had picked up and something was brushing against the siding, but the night was still. I could hear the insects outside, the rustle of leaves, but no wind. And besides, the tapping was too steady, too human. I sat up in bed, heart thudding. My room was dimly lit by the moon, enough to see the shapes of my furniture, but not much else. The tapping stopped. Silence. I waited, holding my breath again. Then came the light. It wasn't from the woods this time. It came from directly outside my window, just like before, but closer. This time I could see the reflection of the flashlight's beam on the glass itself. The way it shimmered slightly as it moved, scanning across the pane like a scanner. Then it paused, right where my face was. I dropped to the floor. I crawled to the other side of the bed, too afraid to peek again. I wanted to call for my parents, but my voice had vanished. My throat felt tight, my tongue dry. So I just sat there, curled up, heart hammering. I don't know how long I stayed like that. It felt like hours. Eventually, I crawled into my closet and shut the door, curling up between winter coats and plastic bins. That's where I stayed until morning. When I finally told my dad what happened, he didn't laugh. He looked tired and skeptical. He went out to check the yard, walked around the side of the house, and came back shaking his head. "There's no footprints," he said. "No sign anyone was even out there." I could tell he didn't believe me. Not really. But that day I noticed something strange. One of the flashlights from our garage was missing. After the flashlight incident, I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind that blew against the siding, made me sit up in bed. I started barricading my door at night with an old toy chest and hiding my baseball bat under the covers. It made me feel safer, but not safe. The worst part, my parents started looking at me differently, like I was making things up, like I was crying out for attention. One evening, I overheard my mom talking to my dad in the kitchen. "He's just lonely," she whispered. "That's a big change. Maybe we should take him to a therapist." That's when I stopped telling them anything. I kept my fears to myself, but things just kept getting worse. For a while, the light didn't come back, not in the same way, but I began to notice little things out of place. One morning, I woke up to find the window unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. Another time, I found a footprint under the window, perfectly imprinted in the soft dirt, pointing toward the house. It wasn't my dad's boot. Then, about a month later, the dog disappeared. It was just gone. No barking, no whining. I let it out in the yard before dinner like I always did, but this time it didn't come back. We searched the woods, calling its name for hours. Nothing. My dad said it was a coyote. I didn't say a word, but I knew. That night I was looking out the window, eyes wide, lights off, when I saw something move in the trees. At first it was just a shadow. Then the flashlight came on again, except this time it wasn't pointed at the house. It was pointed straight up at the sky like a signal. It flickered, then went dark, then came on again. A slow, strange rhythm. I pressed my forehead against the glass, and then I saw him, standing just across the tree line facing the house. Still as a rock, only this time he wasn't alone. There was another figure beside him, shorter, thinner, holding something in his hand, glowing in the moonlight. I slammed the curtains shut and curled under the bed, hugging my teddy bear until the sky turned gray. That was the first night I truly believed I wouldn't live to see morning. It happened on the night of the first thunderstorm of the season. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I sat in bed, staring at the window, trying to convince myself to sleep. Rain tapped gently against the glass. Lightning blinked beyond the trees. Every time the sky lit up, I searched for movement, some figure caught mid-step, some shape watching. But all I saw was trees. Then the power went out. The house fell into complete silence. Not even the rain could be heard through the sudden pressure in my ears, like the whole forest had gone still. I don't know what made me get up, but I found myself tiptoeing down the hall with a flashlight in one hand and my bat in the other. I didn't head toward my parents' room. I didn't think they'd believe me. I went to the back door, just to check, just to prove to myself that everything was fine. But it wasn't. The door was wide open. No wind, no creaking hinges. Just open like someone had been there moments ago. I turned to run, and that's when I heard it. From upstairs. From my room. Tap, tap, tap. I ran back up, lungs burning, skidding into my doorway. There was someone standing in front of my window. Not outside, inside. A tall man soaking wet, holding a flashlight in one hand. Its beam was pointed at the ceiling, casting his face in a sick shadow. His other hand, it held something long and silver, a blade, and he was smiling. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he said. Took me a while to find the right key, but I knew you'd keep the old lock. My mouth wouldn't work, my legs wouldn't move. But behind me I heard footsteps, light, slow, familiar. Another person entered the room, a smaller figure I had seen in the woods. Closer now I could see. It was a child, a boy, pale, thin, with wide, empty eyes. He looked just like me, identical. The tall man knelt and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. This one's done watching. He wants to live in the light now. And then the flashlight went out. I didn't scream. Not at first. The darkness swallowed everything, the room, the man, the boy, who looked like me. But I could still hear them. Their footsteps slow and heavy. The man's breathing steady and close. The boy's laughter. That soft, breathy giggle I'd never heard from my own mouth, but knew instantly was mine. And that's what finally broke me. I screamed. I don't even remember thinking, I just ran. I shoved past where I thought the door was slammed into the hallway wall, bounced off and sprinted down the stairs. My feet slipped on the wooden steps, and I hit the floor hard, knocking the breath out of my lungs. But I didn't stop. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the drawer, and bolted out the back door into the rain. The storm was still raging. Wind howled through the trees, lightning cracked across the sky. But I didn't care. I kept running barefoot, soaked, bleeding from my knees, into the woods behind our house. I didn't look back. Somewhere behind me I heard a voice shouting my name. Not my dad's voice, mine. I kept going. Eventually I collapsed near the old logging trail, completely disoriented. My lungs burned. My legs were jelly. I curled up beneath a tree, gripping the knife with numb fingers, and waited for morning. When the sun came up, I was covered in scratches and mud. I walked until I found a ranger station. They called my parents, and the police came too. But when they searched our house, there was no sign of forced entry. No footprints, no knife missing, and my room perfectly untouched. No sign that anyone had ever stood inside it. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed. Except for one thing. Sitting on my windowsill was an old rusted flashlight, and carved into the wooden frame beneath it 6 words. I lived here before you did. After that night, my parents didn't let me stay in the house alone again. Not that I wanted to. We moved a month later. They told friends and family it was because of the incident, but they never explained what that incident was. They didn't believe me, not really, but they saw how pale I got every time someone mentioned our old home. They saw how I flinched at every sound, every flicker of light outside my window. They wanted to forget, but I couldn't. Even years later, I still think about the boy, the copy of me, the man who knew things he shouldn't have, the key, the flashlight. The way he said, "This one's done watching," like he had been waiting for something to finish. Therapy didn't help. Medication numbed me, but the nightmares bled through anyway. And then, about 6 months ago, almost 15 years after we moved, I got a letter. No return address, no name. Inside was a single photograph. It was my old bedroom, the window in frame. Standing just outside of it on a ladder was a boy. Not 10 years old, 25. My age now, smiling, and holding a flashlight. On the back of the photo were 7 words scribbled in faded pencil. It's your turn to live in the dark. Garrett pedaled his old bike through the crumbling streets on the outskirts of Mexico City, the summer sun sinking behind the jagged skyline. He had barely secured a room in the decrepit Santa Lucia Co-op, a forgotten clutch of 3 aging houses tethered together by cracked concrete and rusting fences. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even particularly safe, but it was cheap, close enough to the university, and Garrett didn't have the luxury of being picky. The co-op was a strange melting pot. Young students like himself, weary graduate assistants, a handful of 30-somethings chasing second degrees. Yet none caught Garrett's eye like the woman in the neighboring house. She looked to be in her late 50s, though her stooped frame and shock white hair made her seem older. She walked with a stiff, limping gait, as if carrying some invisible injury. Her face was a hardened mask of blankness, as though she'd forgotten how to emote entirely. Garrett first noticed her lurking near the communal kitchen. Odd, since each house supposedly had its own facilities. She stood motionless against the peeling wallpaper, while students cooked, laughed, and blasted music. She didn't speak, she didn't eat. She just watched. Several times, Garrett caught her staring at him specifically, though when he glanced back, her gaze slid away indifferent. No one else seemed to notice her presence. It was as if the others had silently agreed to ignore her, a quiet pact he hadn't been told about. That weekend, Garrett sat hunched over his desk, struggling with coursework, when movement outside his window drew his eyes upward. There she was standing dead center in the street, staring directly at his second-floor window. No sidewalk, no pretense, just standing there in the cold night air, utterly still. A sick, crawling feeling twisted in his gut. Was she looking at him? At the building in general? He wasn't sure, acting on some misplaced instinct. Garrett raised his hand in a small, awkward wave. The woman's reaction was instant and bizarre. She hopped up and down like an excited child, then sprinted toward her own house with a staggering, off-kilter gait. Garrett lowered his hand, heart hammering. A line had been crossed. Somehow he'd made himself visible to her, and now she knew exactly which room was his. That night, unease rooted deep in his bones. When he asked his housemates about the woman, they shrugged with strange detachment. "She's always been here," one said flatly. Best not to bother with her. The warning delivered so casually unsettled Garrett more than anything else. He felt it deep down. Something in this place was wrong, and he was only just beginning to realize it. Days blurred together in the oppressive heat, but Garrett couldn't shake the gnawing sense of being watched. Even inside his room, blinds drawn, he sometimes felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a phantom presence hovering just beyond his sight. It was nearly 2 in the morning when it happened. Garrett had been half asleep, the old floor fan humming uselessly against the stifling air. A faint, deliberate knock jolted him upright, not at the door to his room, but from inside the walls. He froze, straining his ears. Knock, knock, knock. A slow, almost methodical rhythm. It wasn't the building settling, it wasn't pipes. It was deliberate swallowing against the dryness in his throat. Garrett swung his legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the closet. The knocks had shifted softer now, like fingertips brushing against the wood from the inside. He hesitated, heart pounding so violently he thought it might give him away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was overtired, stressed, hallucinating. Yet some deeper, more primal part of him screamed that he was not alone. Summoning every shred of courage, Garrett flung open the closet door. Nothing. Only his tangled shirts and worn-out sneakers stared back at him. He exhaled, shaky with relief. Of course, there was nothing there. It was an old building full of creaks and groans. He was letting the weirdness of the past few weeks get to him. But just as he turned back toward the bed, something shifted in the corner of his vision. A fleeting glimpse of movement near the window. Garrett spun around, heart leaping into his throat. Pressed against the outside of the glass, almost invisible against the night, was a pale, grinning face. The woman. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, impossibly, she began tapping her forehead lightly against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Each impact a soft, sickening thud. Garrett stumbled backward, colliding with his desk. The noise must have startled her because she vanished in a blink, swallowed by the darkness beyond the window. He stood there for what felt like hours, every muscle rigid, waiting for another knock, another sign. None came. Eventually, Garrett collapsed back onto his bed, drenched in sweat, mind racing. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. A nightmare bleeding into reality. He told himself that, repeated it like a mantra. But deep down, he knew better. The days that followed blurred into an anxious haze. Garrett found himself checking every window, every door, every shadow stretching across the floor. Sleep became a rare, broken thing, punctuated by the phantom sounds of tapping and faint whispers he couldn't quite catch. Desperation clawed at him until one evening he cornered Lee, a fellow tenant who had lived there longer than most. Lee was reluctant to talk, his eyes darting nervously as if even mentioning her was dangerous. "She wasn't always here," Lee finally muttered. "Years ago there was an incident. Some student disappeared. After that she started showing up. Nobody knew who let her stay. Nobody really wanted to know." Garrett pressed for more, but Lee clammed up, retreating into his room and locking the door with a sharp click. That night, Garrett dreamt of the woman standing over his bed, her hair dripping wet, her mouth moving soundlessly as if mouthing a warning he could not hear. When he woke up, he found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the foot of his bed. And nowhere else panic simmered beneath his skin. Now a constant vibrating hum, Garrett became obsessed with locking everything, double-checking latches, propping chairs under doorknobs, but nothing made him feel safer. Late one evening, he overheard two older residents whispering near the laundry room. Huddled behind a cracked door, he strained to listen. "She doesn't just watch," one murmured. "She chooses." "It's happening again," the other said, voice barely a breath. Just like before. Garrett stumbled back, a sick dread pooling in his stomach. They knew something terrible, and it was unfolding all over again. He realized with a bone-deep certainty that the woman had chosen him. The breaking point came. A few nights later, Garrett jolted awake to the sound of his doorknob rattling violently, the thin wood of his door groaning under the pressure. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering against his ribs as the chair he had wedged under the knob skittered across the floor. From the other side of the door came a sound, not a voice, not quite. It was a low, wet crooning, a desperate murmur that seemed to burrow straight into his bones. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a desk lamp, and braced himself. When the door burst inward with a deafening crack, Garrett swung wildly, The lamp connected with something soft. A figure crumpled into the room, gasping and sobbing. Not the woman, it was Lee. Lee trembling, blood trickling from a split lip, eyes wild with terror. "You have to leave," he gasped, clutching Garrett's sleeve with desperate fingers. "You don't understand. You can't stay. She's not what you think." Before Garrett could respond, a shadow darkened the hallway behind Lee. The woman emerged slow and inevitable, her face slack, her hands hanging uselessly at her sides. Except the closer she came, the more Garrett saw. The woman wasn't walking. She was being moved, puppeted like a marionette by thin, almost invisible threads gleaming in the dim light anchored somewhere high above the ceiling. Something else was controlling her. Something hidden. Something watching. As Lee sobbed at his feet, Garrett realized with stomach-churning horror that the woman had never chosen him. It had. And now it was coming for him, too. Garrett didn't think instinct screamed louder than logic. He grabbed Lee by the arm and hauled him up, shoving them both through the broken door and into the hallway. The air was thick, heavy. It felt like moving through syrup. Behind them, the woman, no, the thing using her, lurched forward with grotesque, jerky steps. Garrett sprinted toward the back staircase, Lee stumbling after him, but the world around them seemed to distort the hallway, stretching longer and longer, the walls sagging inward like a throat preparing to swallow. Something brushed Garrett's neck, a whisper of thread, a phantom tug, and he almost fell. He screamed and batted at the invisible force, feeling it coil against his skin. They burst into the kitchen. Garrett snatched a box of matches from the counter, hardly thinking smoke fire. Maybe it hated fire. He overturned a bottle of cheap tequila onto the floor, the fumes burning his nostrils, and struck a match. For a second, the flame trembled in his hand, fragile and defiant. Then he dropped it. The kitchen exploded into flames, heat slamming into him like a fist. Garrett and Lee stumbled back, coughing, as the fire raced hungrily up the walls. Through the smoke, Garrett saw the woman, their strings snapping one by one, her body folding to the floor like a discarded doll. But the feeling, the presence lingered. He dragged Lee through the smoke-choked halls, down the crumbling stairs, out into the cool night air. Behind them, the Santa Lucia Co-op roared with fire, the windows glowing hellishly. Neighbors shouted and sirens wailed in the distance. Garrett collapsed onto the pavement, lungs burning, vision swimming. He had escaped, or so he thought. Weeks later, Garrett stood alone across the street from the blackened ruins of the Santa Lucia Co-op. The fire had gutted it completely. Nothing remained but a skeletal frame of charred wood and melted steel sagging against the gray skyline like a corpse left to rot. The authorities had ruled it accidental, faulty wiring, an old building neglected and dangerous. No mention of the woman, no mention of the thing that had moved her. Garrett hadn't seen Lee since that night. Maybe he had left the city altogether. Maybe he hadn't made it at all. Garrett told himself he was fine, that the nightmare was over. He moved into a sterile apartment on the other side of town, one with bright lights and neighbors who smiled too much and never asked questions. But at night, when the shadows stretched long across the ceiling, he sometimes thought he heard it again. The tapping, soft, methodical, tap, tap, tap. One evening, exhausted and fed up with his own nerves, Garrett ripped open the blinds of his new bedroom window. Nothing was there, relieved. He turned back to his bed and froze. On his pillow, neatly placed in the center, lay a single strand of thread, thin and almost invisible, shimmering under the lamplight. It had found him again. It was only a matter of time.